This is Audible.
Macmillan Audio presents Putin's People by Catherine Belton. Read for you by Dugald Bruce Lockhart.
Russian organized crime leaders, their members, their associates are moving into Western Europe. They are purchasing property, they are establishing bank accounts, they're establishing companies, they're weaving themselves into the fabric of society. And by the time that Europe develops an awareness, it's going to be too late. Former FBI Special Agent Bob Levinson. I want to warn Americans. As a people, you are very naive about Russia and its intentions. You believe because the Soviet Union no longer exists, Russia now is your friend. It isn't. And I can show you how the SVR is trying to destroy the US even today, and even more than the KGB did during the Cold War. Sergei Tretyakov, former colonel in Russian Foreign Intelligence, the SVR, stationed in New York. Dramatis Personae. Putin's inner circle, the Siloviki. Igor Sechin, Putin's trusted gatekeeper, a former KGB operative from St. Petersburg who rose in power as deputy head of Putin's Kremlin to lead the state takeover of the Russian oil sector. Later became known as Russia's Darth Vader for his ruthless propensity for plots. Nikolai Patrushev, powerful former head of the Federal Security Service, FSB, the successor agency to the KGB and current Security Council chief. Viktor Ivanov, former KGB officer who served with Putin in the Leningrad KGB and oversaw personnel as deputy head of Putin's Kremlin during his first term, leading the Kremlin's initial expansion into the economy. Viktor Cherkasov, former senior KGB officer who ran the St. Petersburg FSB and was a mentor to Putin, moving with him to Moscow, where he remained a close advisor, first as first deputy head of the FSB and then running the Federal Drug Service. Sergei Ivanov, former Leningrad KGB officer who became one of the youngest ever deputy heads of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service in the 90s and then rose in power under Putin's presidency, first as defense minister and then as Kremlin chief of staff. Dmitry Medvedev, former lawyer who started out working as a deputy to Putin in the St. Petersburg administration when he was in his early 20s and followed closely in Putin's footsteps thereafter. First as a deputy head of the Kremlin administration, then as its chief of staff, then as Putin's interim replacement as president. The custodians, the KGB-connected businessmen. Gennady Timchenko, alleged former KGB operative who rose through the ranks of Soviet trade to become co-founder of one of the first independent traders of oil products before the Soviet fall. Worked closely with Putin from the early 90s, and according to some associates, before the Soviet collapse. Yuri Kovalchuk, former physicist who joined with other KGB-connected businessmen to take over Bank Rossiya, a St. Petersburg bank that, according to the US Treasury, became the personal bank for Putin and other senior Russian officials. Arkady Rotenberg, former Putin judo partner who became a billionaire under Putin's presidency after the state awarded his company's multi-billion-dollar construction contracts. Vladimir Yakunin, former senior KGB officer who served a stint undercover at the United Nations in New York, then joined with Kovalchuk in taking over Bank Rossiya. Putin anointed him chief of the state railways monopoly. The family. The coterie of relatives, officials and businessmen closely surrounding the first Russian president, Boris Yeltsin. Valentin Numashev, former journalist who gained Yeltsin's trust while writing his memoirs and was anointed Kremlin chief of staff in 1997, married Yeltsin's daughter Tatiana in 2002. Tatiana Dyachenko, Yeltsin's daughter who officially served as his image advisor but was essentially gatekeeper to the president. Boris Berezovsky, former mathematician who made his fortune running trading schemes for car maker Avto VAZ, the producer of the boxy Zhiguli car that epitomized the Soviet era and inveigled his way into the good graces of Yeltsin and his family. When he acquired the Sibneft oil major, he became the epitome of the intensely politically wired oligarchs of the Yeltsin era. Alexander Voloshin, former economist who started out working with Berezovsky on privatizations and other schemes, and was transferred to the Kremlin in 1997 to work as Yumashev's deputy chief of staff, promoted to chief of staff in 1999. Roman Abramovich, oil trader who became Berezovsky's protégé and later outmaneuvered him to take over Berezovsky's business empire, cashier to the Yeltsin family and then to Putin. Sergei Pugachev, Russian Orthodox banker who was a master of the Byzantine financing schemes of Yeltsin's Kremlin and then became known as Putin's banker too. Co-founder of Mezprombank, he straddled the worlds of the family and the Siloviki. The Yeltsin-era oligarch who crossed Putin's men. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, former member of the Communist Youth League, who became one of Russia's first and most successful businessmen of the Perestroika era and the 1990s. The mobsters, foot soldiers for the KGB. St. Petersburg. Ilya Traber, former Soviet submariner who became a black market antiques trader in the Perestroika years, and then an intermediary between Putin's security services and the Tambov organized crime group, controlling St. Petersburg's most strategic assets, the seaport and the oil terminal. Vladimir Kumarin, Tambov organized crime boss who lost an arm in an assassination attempt and became known as St. Petersburg's night governor, joining in business with Putin's men, most notably with Ilya Traber. Moscow. Semyon Mogilevich, former wrestler, known as the Brainy Don, who at the end of the 80s became banker to the leaders of Russia's most powerful organized crime groups, including the Solntsevskaya, funneling cash into the West and setting up a criminal empire of drugs and arms trafficking of his own. Recruited in the 70s by the KGB, he was the criminal arm of the Russian state. Sergei Mikhailov, head of the Solntsevskaya organized crime group, Moscow's most powerful, with close ties to many of the KGB-connected businessmen who later cultivated connections with New York property mogul Donald Trump. Vyacheslav Ivankov, Yaponchik, mobster dispatched by Mogilevich to Brighton Beach, New York, to oversee the Solntsevskaya's criminal empire there. Yevgeny Dvoskin, Brighton Beach mobster who became one of Russia's most notorious shadow bankers, after moving back to Moscow with his uncle Ivankov, joining forces with the Russian security services to funnel tens of billions of dollars in black cash into the West. Felix Sater, Dvoskin's best friend since childhood, became a key business partner of the Trump Organization, developing a string of properties for Trump, all the while retaining high-level contacts in Russian intelligence. Prologue. Moscow rules. It was late in the evening in May 2015, and Sergei Pugachev was flicking through an old family photo album he'd found from 13 years ago or more. In one photo from a birthday party at his Moscow dacha, his son Viktor keeps his eyes downcast as Vladimir Putin's daughter smiles and whispers in his ear. In another, Viktor and his other son Alexander are posing on a wooden spiral staircase in the Kremlin presidential library with Putin's two daughters. At the edge of the photo, Lyudmila Putina, then still the Russian president's wife, smiles. We were sitting in the kitchen of Pugachev's latest residence, a 3-story townhouse in the well-heeled London area of Chelsea. The late evening light glanced in through the cathedral-sized windows, and birds chirped in the trees outside, the traffic from the nearby King's Road a faint hum. The high-powered life Pugachev had once enjoyed in Moscow, the deal-making, the endless behind-the-scenes agreements, the understandings between friends in the Kremlin corridors of power, seemed a world away. But Moscow's influence was in fact still lurking like a shadow outside his door. The day before, Pugachev had been forced to seek the protection of the UK counter-terrorism squad. His bodyguards had found suspicious-looking boxes with protruding wires taped to the undercarriage of his Rolls-Royce, as well as on the car used to transport his 3 youngest children, aged 7, 5 and 3, to school. Now, on the wall of the Pugachev sitting room, behind the rocking horse and across from the family portraits, the SO-15 counter-terrorism squad had installed a grey box containing an alarm that could be activated in the event of an attack. 15 years before, Pugachev had been a Kremlin insider who'd manoeuvred endlessly behind the scenes to help bring Vladimir Putin to power. Once known as the Kremlin's banker, he'd been a master of the backroom deals, the sleights of hand that governed the country then. For years, he'd seemed untouchable, a member of an inner circle at the pinnacle of power that had made and bent the rules to suit themselves, with law enforcement, the courts, and even elections subverted for their needs. But now the Kremlin machine he'd once been part of had turned against him. The tall Russian Orthodox believer with a dark beard and a gregarious grin had become the latest victim of Putin's relentlessly expanding reach. First, the Kremlin had moved in on his business empire, taking it for itself. Pugachev had left Russia, first for France and then for England, as the Kremlin launched its attack. Putin's men had taken the hotel project the president had granted him on Red Square, a stone's throw from the Kremlin, without any compensation at all. Then his shipyards, two of the biggest in Russia, valued at $3.5 billion, were acquired by one of Putin's closest allies, Igor Sechin, for a fraction of that sum. Then his coal project, the world's biggest coking coal deposit in the Siberian region of Tuva, valued at $4 billion, was taken by a close associate of Ramzan Kadyrov, the strongman Chechen president, for $150 million. In the process, Putin's men had blamed him for the collapse of Mezprombank, the bank he'd co-founded long ago in the 90s that had once been the key to his power. The Kremlin authorities had opened a criminal case claiming Pugachev had caused the bank's bankruptcy by transferring $700 million from it to a Swiss bank account at the height of the 2008 financial crisis. The Kremlin paid no regard to Pugachev's claims that the money was his own. It seemed to matter little that the takeover of the shipyards by Sechin at a fraction of their value was the biggest reason for the shortfall in the bank's funds to creditors. The hand of the Kremlin seemed clear. People within the state manipulated the rules against him in order to bring the bank down, unsurprisingly benefiting themselves, said Richard Hainsworth, a long-standing Russian banking expert. It was a typical story for a Kremlin machine that had become relentless in its reach. First, it had gone after political enemies, but now it was starting to turn on Putin's one-time allies. Pugachev was the first of the inner circle to fall, and now the Kremlin had expanded its campaign against him from the brutal closed-door courts of Moscow to the veneer of respectability of London's High Court. There, it obtained a freezing order against his assets with ease, tying the tycoon up in knots in the courtroom along the way. Ever since Pugachev had left Russia, the Kremlin had pursued him. At his home in France, he'd been threatened by stooges sent by Mezprombank's liquidator. 3 members of a Moscow mafia group had taken him out to a yacht off the coast of Nice and demanded he pay $350 million to guarantee his family's safety. It was the price of peace, they told him. The price for making the Russian criminal case against him for the Mezprom bankruptcy go away, documentary evidence shows. In the UK courts, Pugachev had been a fish totally out of water, incapable of operating according to their unfamiliar rules and procedures. He was too accustomed to the backroom deals of his Kremlin past, too accustomed to slipping through the net of rules and regulations because of his position and power. He hadn't done himself any favours. Convinced of the righteousness of his position, that he was the victim of the latest Kremlin asset grab, he believed himself above the regulations of the British courts. He'd failed to stick to court orders related to the asset freeze and had burned through millions of pounds from an account he'd kept hidden from the UK court. He believed that the disclosure rules were beneath him, petty compared to the calamity that had befallen his business empire, and no more than part of a Kremlin campaign to hound and frustrate him at every turn. The Kremlin, however, had become adept at pursuing its enemies through the UK court system, while a PR machine was honed to fill the pages of the UK tabloids with allegations of the Russian oligarch's stolen wealth. The Kremlin had first learned to navigate its way through the UK court system during its victory against Boris Berezovsky, the exiled oligarch who'd become Putin's fiercest critic, in a case that seemed to turn Russian history on its head. Berezovsky was the fast-talking, one-time Kremlin insider who had tried, and failed, to sue his erstwhile business partner Roman Abramovich, a close Kremlin ally, for $6.5 billion in London's High Court. The judge overseeing the case, Dame Elizabeth Gloucester, had taken a dim view of Berezovsky's claim that he jointly owned one of Russia's biggest oil majors, Sibneft, and a stake in Rusal, Russia's biggest aluminium giant, with Abramovich, and that Abramovich had forced him to sell his stakes at a knockdown price. Though Berezovsky was recognized throughout Russia as owner of these concerns, Mrs. Justice Gloucester said she found him to be an inherently unreliable witness, and sided with Abramovich, who'd claimed that Berezovsky had never owned these assets. He'd merely been paid for providing political patronage. Later, it turned out that Mrs. Justice Gloucester's stepson had been paid nearly £500,000 to represent Abramovich in the early stages of the case, far more than had previously been disclosed. The Kremlin had further honed its operations in the UK court system through its pursuit of Mukhtar Ablyazov, a Kazakh billionaire who happened to be the biggest political foe of the Kazakh president, a key Kremlin ally, Nursultan Nazarbayev. Ablyazov was pursued by Russia's State Deposit Insurance Agency, which charged him with siphoning more than $4 billion from the Kazakh BTA Bank, of which he'd been chairman and which had branches across Russia. The Russian agency hired a team of lawyers from the top London law firm Hogan Lovells, who launched 11 civil fraud lawsuits against Ablyazov in the UK, as well as a freezing order on his assets. Private detectives had traced the siphoned $4 billion to a network of offshore companies controlled by the Kazakh tycoon. But in Pugachev's case, no stolen or hidden assets appeared to have been found. No fraud claims had ever been launched in the UK or anywhere else outside Russia. Instead, on the basis of a Russian court ruling alone, the same team from Hogan Lovells had won the freezing order against Pugachev's assets, and ably ran rings around him while he chafed at the multitude of court orders that came his way. He'd been interrogated over asset disclosures and found to have given false evidence over whether the sale of his coal business had been conducted by himself or by his son. It didn't seem to matter to the judge that the sale had been forced through at a price that was less than 1/20th of the business's real value. What mattered was whether he'd followed procedure and declared all the assets that remained under his control. Pugachev had been forced to hand over his passports to the court and was banned from leaving the UK during a prolonged period of questioning over his asset disclosures as the Kremlin's lawyers tightened the legal net. He'd run through a series of lawyers who in turn seemed baffled by a case that had never been heard on its merits in the UK, while others viewed him mendaciously as easy prey. Spoilt by the flood of Russian cases that Moscow's tycoons were willing to pay top prices for, airing in London's High Court, legal firms padded their bills to astronomical sums for work that was never done, as documents show. PR firms offered to defend Pugachev's image for £100,000 a month. "He's on our territory now," said one partner at a global law firm representing him. At first, Pugachev had believed the case against him was being driven by unruly Kremlin underlings, anxious to draw a line over the expropriation of his business empire. But as the campaign expanded, and Pugachev began to fear for his physical safety, he became convinced that it was being guided by Putin himself. "How could he do this to me? I even made him president," he said that evening as he sat in his Chelsea kitchen, still shell-shocked by the visit from SO15 and the suspicious devices found underneath his cars. A former friend sent by the Kremlin to London had told him that Putin was personally managing every step of the campaign against him, warning, "We have control of everything here. We've got everything all stitched up." Pugachev had long detected the growing influence of Kremlin cash in London. Long before the legal attack started, he said he'd met a string of English lords who'd guffawed and shaken his hand, and told him how great they thought Putin was. In those days, they believed Pugachev was Putin's banker, as the press had called him then, yet they'd still asked him to donate to the Conservative Party without any question or thought. All his former friends from the Kremlin kept relatives and mistresses in town, who they visited at weekends, flooding the city with cash. There was Sechen's ex-wife, Marina, who kept a house with her daughter here. There was Igor Shuvalov, the deputy prime minister, who owned the most prestigious flat in the city, a penthouse overlooking Trafalgar Square. There were the sons of Arkady Rotenberg, Putin's billionaire former judo partner, who attended one of the country's most vaunted private schools, while his ex-wife Natalia shopped and sued her husband for divorce in London's High Court. There was the deputy speaker of the State Duma, one of Russia's most vocal patriots, Sergei Zhelezniak, who'd long raged against the influence of the West, Yet his daughter Anastasia had lived in London for years. The list of officials resident in London was endless, said Pugachev. They have sorted themselves out very well on this small island with terrible weather, he sniffed. In the UK, the main thing was always money. Putin sent his agents to corrupt the British elite. The city had grown used to the flood of Russian cash. Property prices had surged as first tycoons and then Russian officials had bought up high-end mansions in Knightsbridge, Kensington and Belgravia. A string of Russian share offerings, led by the state's Rosneft, Sberbank and VTB, had helped pay the rents and wages for the offices of London's well-heeled PR and legal firms. Lords and former politicians were paid lavish salaries to serve on Russian companies' boards, although they were granted little oversight of corporate conduct. Russia's influence was everywhere. Alexander Lebedev, the former KGB officer and banker who'd positioned himself as a champion of the free press in Russia, had acquired London's most read and influential daily, The Evening Standard, becoming a fixture at the capital's soirees and on the lists for the most sought-after dinner invitations. Another was Dmitry Firtash, a Ukrainian tycoon who'd become the Kremlin's gas trader of choice, and who, despite his links to a major Russian mobster wanted by the FBI, Semyon Mogilovich, had become a billionaire donor to Cambridge University. His chief London minion, Robert Shetler-Jones, had donated millions of pounds to the Tories, while influential party grandees served on the board of Firtash's British-Ukrainian Society. There were other, less noticeable players. At least one of them had slipped through the cracks to become close friends with Boris Johnson, then London's mayor, at the top of the Tory elite. Everyone has gotten used to spies wearing dark glasses and looking suspicious in films, said Pugachev. But here, they are everywhere. They look normal. You can't tell. Pugachev had no idea whether the envoy sent by the Kremlin to warn him that it had everything stitched up in the UK was telling the truth, or whether he'd been sent merely to frighten him. But at some point, after he found the suspicious-looking devices on his cars, and after he first got wind that Russia was going to seek his extradition from the UK, he decided he didn't want to risk waiting to find out. Despite his previous closeness to Putin and his extensive contacts with the Kremlin's clan of former KGB men known as the Siloviki, a meeting set up for him with a top-level official from the British Foreign Office had been cancelled at the last minute. Instead, he'd been told by a visiting Kremlin agent that he should meet a man Russian intelligence had cultivated in MI6. Everything was being turned on its head. He feared that the UK government was preparing a deal with the Russians to extradite him. He wondered, too, about the fate of his friend Boris Berezovsky, the arch-Kremlin critic who in March 2013 had been found dead on the floor of his bathroom in his country mansion in Berkshire, his favourite black cashmere scarf round his neck, an unidentified fingerprint left at the scene. For some unknown reason, Scotland Yard didn't investigate, leaving it to the local Thames Valley Police, which called it a suicide and closed the case. It looks like there is an agreement with Russia not to make a fuss, Pugachev worried. And so one day in June 2015, a few weeks after we'd met in his Chelsea home, Pugachev was suddenly no longer in the UK. His phones had all been switched off, ditched by the wayside as he ran. He'd ignored the court orders forbidding him to leave the country. He hadn't even told his partner, the mother of his 3 young children, the London socialite Alexandra Tolstoy, who was left waiting late into the night for him to appear at her father's 80th birthday party. He'd last been seen in a meeting with his lawyers, at which they'd warned him he'd need £10 million to secure bail on an imminent Russian extradition request, cash to which Pugachev didn't have access. A few weeks later, he surfaced in France, where he gained citizenship in 2009, and where French law protected its citizens from extradition to Russia. He'd fled to the relative safety of his villa high in the hills above the Bay of Nice, a fortress surrounded by an impenetrable high iron fence, a team of bodyguards, and a battery of security cameras at every turn. The ease with which the Kremlin had been able to pursue its case against him in London seemed to Pugachev, as the Russians would say, like the first lastochka, the first swallow of spring. It was the arrival of Moscow rules in London, where the Kremlin could twist and distort the legal process to suit its agenda, where the larger issue of its expropriation of Pugachev's multi-billion-dollar business empire could be artfully buried in the minutiae of rules related to the freezing order, and whether Pugachev had correctly followed them. Pugachev was no angel, of course. It was not at all clear what had happened to the $700 million he'd been accused of siphoning from Mezprombank. But a series of asset disclosures, unquestioned by the UK High Court, had revealed that $250 million of that money had been returned to the bank, while the trail of the remainder had been lost in companies liquidated by a former Pugachev ally who was now working closely with the Kremlin. Later, Swiss prosecutors, asked by Russia to block Pugachev's Swiss bank accounts, said they'd found no evidence that any crime was committed when the $700 million was transferred from Pugachev's company accounts in Mezprombank to the Swiss bank account at the height of the 2008 crisis. But even though the Kremlin lawyers had not opened a fraud case against him in the UK, even though there appeared to be no trail of stolen funds, the legal pursuit of Pugachev was relentless. Lawyers working for the Russian State Deposit Agency insisted they had him banged to rights over Mezprombank's bankruptcy. If you get cash from a regulator, you should take it to help the bank survive, not fund a payment to yourself, one person close to the legal team said. Despite the Kremlin having expropriated his business empire and his having begun to fear for his life, Pugachev was found in contempt of court for fleeing the UK and sentenced in absentia to 2 years in jail. During the contempt hearings, he was frequently branded a liar. He'd flouted the rules of the freezing order. He'd not only fled the country, but transferred funds from the sale of 2 cars to France. One of the judges presiding over the case, Justice Vivienne Rose, found she could not safely rely on any evidence he gave. A New Zealand trust he'd set up to hold tens of millions of dollars in properties, including his Chelsea home, was later found to be a sham. For all his flaws, Pugachev insisted he'd been caught in a Russian state vendetta pursued through the UK courts. The Kremlin seemed intent on quashing any notion that he'd ever been well connected in the Kremlin, or that he could have any knowledge that could be damaging to it. It had been able to suppress any political connotation to the case by leveraging the diminishing knowledge of Russia in the UK intelligence services, which had been distracted by monitoring the Islamic terrorist threat and Pugachev's own low profile. Before things had got tough in London, Pugachev had never given an interview in his life. Few knew who he was. Most people believed it was the recently deceased oligarch Boris Berezovsky who had helped bring Putin to power. Lawyers at Hogan Lovells had been told that Pugachev was a nobody, and the case against him had nothing to do with politics. "I've not seen any evidence of what he was doing in the Kremlin," said one person close to the legal team. "We have to be extremely careful. Pugachev seems to say whatever he wants. The people I've spoken to just say he was a blatant crook." But in fact, Pugachev had worked at the heart of the Kremlin and had been privy to some of its deepest secrets, including how it was exactly that Putin came to power. This seemed to be one of the main reasons the Kremlin was so intent on pursuing him and making sure he was tied up in legal knots. Even before the Kremlin took over his business empire, he'd been seeking to leave Russia, to escape the endless intrigue of business there. Already he'd been sidelined by Putin's KGB allies from St. Petersburg, and he'd begun seeking French citizenship in 2007. For those on the inside, Pugachev was being punished precisely for seeking to exit the tight-knit system that ruled Russia, the mafia clan which no one was ever meant to leave. Pugachev was like a kidney. He was essential for the functioning of the system, but he lost his mind and thought he could leave and work on his own business. Of course the order was given to destroy him, said a senior Russian banker involved in financial operations for the Kremlin. In the rush of his flight from the UK to France, Pugachev left behind a number of telltale signs. Detectives working for the Kremlin's lawyers had swooped in to raid his Knightsbridge office on a court order issued in the days after his disappearance. Among the reams of documents, there were a number of disk drives. On one of the disk drives were recordings. The Russian security services had been secretly taping every meeting he'd held in his downtown Moscow office since the end of the 90s. One of the recordings vividly documents Pugachev's candid and rueful feelings about Putin and his own role in bringing him to power. The tape records Pugachev sitting in his office with Valentin Yumashev, former President Boris Yeltsin's son-in-law and chief of staff, discussing over dinner and fine wine the tense state of affairs as Moscow hurtled through yet another political crisis. It was November 2007, and just a few months remained before Putin would come to the end of his second term as president, at which point Russia's constitution dictated that he must step down. But although Putin had made vague statements about becoming prime minister after standing down as president, there was not yet even a whisper of his real intentions. In the Warren-like corridors of the Kremlin, the former KGB and security men who had risen to power with Putin had been jostling for position, bickering and backstabbing in hopes that they, or their candidate, would be selected as his successor. Pugachev and Yumashev quietly clinked glasses as they discussed the standoff. The uncertainty over the succession was bringing back strong memories of 1999, when they'd assisted Putin's rise. It seemed to them an age ago. By now, they had been eclipsed by Putin's KGB allies from St. Petersburg. By now, they were almost relics from a totally different era. The system of power had changed irrevocably, and they were still struggling to understand what they'd done. "You remember how it was when he came to power?" says Pugachev on the tape. "He would say, 'I am the manager. I have been hired.'" In those days, Putin had appeared reluctant to take the leading role, and seemed malleable and compliant to those who'd helped bring him to power. "Between us, at the beginning, I think he had the idea to become rich, to live a happy life, to decide his own personal issues," Pugachev goes on. "And in principle, he decided these issues very quickly. But as the 4 years of his first term passed, he understood things had happened that would never allow him to step down." Putin's first term had been drenched in blood and controversy. It led to a sweeping transformation of the way the country was run. He faced a series of deadly terrorist attacks, including the siege of the Dubrovka Theatre in Moscow by Chechen terrorists in October 2002. The hostage-taking ended with hundreds dead when the Russian security services botched the storming of the theatre and gassed the very theatre-goers they'd been trying to free. Putin's battles with rebels from the restive Northern Caucasus Republic of Chechnya had caused thousands of deaths, including the 294 who died in a string of apartment bombings. Many in Moscow whispered Putin's security services were behind these bloody attacks, not least because the end result was a security clampdown that strengthened his power. The freewheeling oligarchs of the 1990s were soon brought to heel. It had taken just one big case against the country's richest man for Putin and his men to rein in the market freedoms of the Yeltsin era and to launch a takeover by the state. "He would have gone gladly after 4 years, I think," Pugachev continues. "But then all these controversies happened. With the West now, there is such a serious standoff that it's almost a Cuban Missile Crisis, and now he's gone even deeper. He understands that if it goes further, he will never get out." For both these men, the power construct built by Putin, by which the president had accumulated so much power that everything now depended on him, looked the very opposite of stable. It's a pyramid. All you have to do is knock it once, and it will all collapse. He understands all this, but he can't change himself. "I don't have the feeling he understands any of this," says Yumashev. "It would be strange if he said everything I did is backward," Pugachev interjects. "Many of the decisions he makes are based on his convictions of how the world is run. The subject of patriotism, he believes this sincerely. When he says the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy, he believes this sincerely. He just has such values. What he does sincerely. He sincerely makes mistakes." Putin had often justified his consolidation of all levers of power, which included ending elections for governors and bringing the court system under Kremlin diktat, by saying such measures were necessary to usher in a new era of stability, ending the chaos and collapse of the 1990s. But behind the patriotic chest-beating that, on the face of it, appeared to drive most of the decision-making was another, more disturbing factor. Putin and the KGB men who ran the economy through a network of loyal allies now monopolized power and had introduced a new system in which state positions were used as vehicles for self-enrichment. It was a far cry from the anti-capitalist, anti-bourgeois principles of the Soviet state they had once served. "These people, they are mutants," says Pugachev. "They are a mixture of Homo Sovieticus with the wild capitalists of the last 20 years. They have stolen so much to fill their pockets. All their families live somewhere in London, but when they say they need to crush someone in the name of patriotism, they say this sincerely. It's just that if it's London they're targeting, they will get their families out first." "I think it is a terrible thing," says Yumashev. "Some of my friends who work in the Kremlin now say, with absolute sincerity, how great it is they can get so rich there. In the 90s, this was unacceptable. You either had to go into business or work for the country. Now they go and work for the state to earn money. Ministers hand out licenses to make money, and of course all this comes from the boss. The first conversation Putin has with a new state employee is, "Here is your business, share it only with me. If someone attacks you, I will defend you, and if you don't use your position as a business, you are an idiot." Putin said this himself, says Pugachev, openly. I remember I was speaking with him. He said, "What is that guy waiting for? Why isn't he earning? What is he waiting for? He has the position, let him make money for himself." These are now like people who have drunk blood. They can't stop. Now it is state officials who are the businessmen. There are very few real businessmen left, Yumashev agrees, shaking his head sadly. The atmosphere has changed so much in the country. The air had changed. It's suffocating now, suffocating. The two men sigh. Everything has changed, apart from their ability to idealize their own roles. What was great about the 90s was that there were no lies, Yumashev continues. Absolutely, says Pugachev. For me, my whole life, the truth was equivalent to freedom. I earned money not for riches, but for freedom. How much can you spend? As long as you have enough to buy 2 pairs of jeans, that's fine. But a certain independence gave me one thing: I don't need to lie. It seemed to the two men that the president had become surrounded by yes-men, all of whom proffered lengthy toasts to Putin, telling him he'd been sent by God to save the country, while they served at his pleasure. Yet it seemed to Pugachev that these yes-men understood the deep hypocrisy of the system, the sham democracy represented by the Kremlin's ruling party, United Russia, and how deeply corrupt it had become. Look at the people around Putin, who say, "Vladimir Vladimirovich, you're a genius," Pugachev continues. I look at them and they don't believe in anything. They understand it's all crap, that United Russia is crap, the elections are crap, the president is crap. But they understand all this, and then they go on stage and say how great everything is, and all the toasts they make, which are total lies. They can sit and tell rubbish about how they've always been together ever since they were sitting on the school bench. But at the same time, the guy sitting in the office next door is saying, "As soon as he comes out, let's finish him off." There is such cynicism. I don't think they feel comfortable. The ones who have power, I am sorry for them. They're stealing from all sides, and then they come out and speak about how Putin is fighting against corruption. I look at them and think, this is the end. I'm sorry for them. Putin was always asking, what is the word beginning with S? Sovest, conscience. They don't have receptors for this. They don't understand it. They forgot the word and what it means. They've gotten totally messed up. All the achievements of the Putin era so far, the economic growth, the increase in incomes, the riches of the billionaires that had turned Moscow into a gleaming metropolis, where sleek foreign cars filled the streets and cozy cafes opened on street corners, boiled down to the sharp increase in the oil price during the Putin years, they agree. In 2000, the oil price was $17 and we were happy, says Yumashev. When you and I were in power, it was $10, $6. The best time for me was when it hit $16 for 2 to 3 weeks. Now it's $150, and the only thing they're doing is building awful houses for themselves. The state is doing nothing with the money. They could have transformed the country's infrastructure, but he thinks everything will be stolen if we build roads. Time is passing so quickly, says Pugachev. 8 years have gone. In 2000, we gave the boss such a smoothly oiled machine. Everything worked. And what did we get? Asked Yumashev. We didn't understand that he wasn't going to drive things forward. I thought he was liberal, young. Pugachev replies. For me, it was principally important that he was young, says Yumashev. You understand it turned out he was from a different species? Yes, they're different people, Yumashev agrees. They are different, special people. This was something we didn't understand. The person who understood this very well was Ustinov, the prosecutor general, says Pugachev. He told me, you understand, the guys from the security services, they are different. Even if you were to suck all their blood out and then put on a different head, they would still be different. They live in their own system. You will never be one of them. It is an absolutely different system. The recording offers a unique window into the unguarded views of two men who had brought Putin to power, and their horror at the system they'd helped create. This book is the story of that system, the rise to power of Putin's KGB cohort, and how they mutated to enrich themselves in the new capitalism. It is the story of the hurried handover of power between Yeltsin and Putin, and of how it enabled the rise of a deep state of KGB security men that had always lurked in the background during the Yeltsin years, but now emerged to monopolize power for 20 years and eventually to endanger the West. This book began as an effort to trace the takeover of the Russian economy by Putin's former KGB associates, but it became an investigation into something more pernicious than that. First research, and then events, showed that the kleptocracy of the Putin era was aimed at something more than just filling the pockets of the president's friends. What emerged as a result of the KGB takeover of the economy and the country's political and legal system was a regime in which the billions of dollars at Putin's cronies' disposal were to be actively used to undermine and corrupt the institutions and democracies of the West. The KGB playbook of the Cold War era, when the Soviet Union deployed active measures to sow division and discord in the West, to fund allied political parties and undermine its imperial foe, has now been fully reactivated. What's different now is that these tactics are funded by a much deeper well of cash, by a Kremlin that has become adept in the ways of the markets and has sunk its tentacles deep into the institutions of the West. Parts of the KGB, Putin among them, have embraced capitalism as a tool for getting even with the West. It was a process that began long before, in the years before the Soviet collapse. Putin's takeover of strategic cash flows was always about more than taking control of the country's economy. For the Putin regime, wealth was less about the well-being of Russia's citizens than about the projection of power, about reasserting the country's position on the world stage. The system Putin's men created was a hybrid KGB capitalism that sought to accumulate cash to buy off and corrupt officials in the West, whose politicians, complacent after the end of the Cold War, had long forgotten about the Soviet tactics of the not-too-distant past. Western markets embraced the new wealth coming from Russia and paid little heed to the criminal and KGB forces behind it. The KGB had forged an alliance with Russian organized crime long ago, on the eve of the Soviet collapse, when billions of dollars worth of precious metals, oil and other commodities was transferred from the state to firms linked to the KGB. From the start, foreign intelligence operatives of the KGB sought to accumulate black cash to maintain and preserve influence networks long thought demolished by the Soviet collapse. For a time under Yeltsin, the forces of the KGB stayed hidden in the background. But when Putin rose to power, the alliance between the KGB and organized crime emerged and bared its teeth. To understand this process, we must go back to the beginning of it all, to the time of the Soviet collapse. For the men who helped bring Putin to power, the revanche has also brought a reckoning. Pugachev and Yumashev had begun the transfer of power in desperate hurry, as Yeltsin's health failed in an attempt to secure the future of the country, and their own safety, against what they believed to be a communist threat. But they too had forgotten the not-too-distant Soviet past. The security men they brought to power were to stop at nothing to prolong their rule beyond the bounds of anything they'd thought possible. "We should have spoken to him more," sighed Yumashev. "Of course," said Pugachev, "but there wasn't any time." Part 1. Chapter 1. Operation Luch. St. Petersburg. It's early February 1992, and an official car from the city administration is slowly driving down the main street of the city. A grey slush has been partially swept from the pavements, and people are trudging through the cold in thick, anonymous coats, laden with bags and hunched against the wind. Behind the fading facades of the once grand houses on Nevsky Prospect, shops stand almost empty, their shelves practically bare in the aftershocks of the Soviet Union's sudden implosion. It's barely 6 weeks since the Soviet Union ceased to exist, since the fateful day when Russia's President Boris Yeltsin and the leaders of the other Soviet republics signed their union out of existence with the stroke of a pen. The city's food distributors are struggling to react to rapid change as the strict Soviet regulations that for decades controlled supply chains and fixed prices had suddenly ceased to exist. In the bus queues and at the impromptu markets that have sprung up across the city as inhabitants seek to earn cash selling shoes and other items from their homes, the talk all winter has been of food shortages, ration cards, and gloom. Making matters worse, hyperinflation is ravaging savings. Some have even warned of famine, sounding alarm bells across a city still gripped by memories of the Second World War blockade, when up to 1,000 people starved to death every day. But the city official behind the wheel of the black Volga sedan looks calm. The slight, resolute figure gazing intently ahead is Vladimir Putin. He's 39, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg and the recently appointed head of the city's Foreign Relations Committee. The scene is being filmed for a series of documentaries on the city's new administration. And this one centres on the youthful-looking deputy mayor, whose responsibilities include ensuring adequate imports of food. As the footage flickers back to his office in City Hall at Smolny, Putin reels off a string of figures on the tons of grain and humanitarian aid being shipped in from Germany, England and France. There is no need for worry, he says. Nearly 10 minutes is spent on careful explanations of the measures his committee has taken to secure emergency supplies of food, including a groundbreaking deal for £20 million worth of livestock grain, secured during a meeting between the city's mayor Anatoly Sobchak and British Prime Minister John Major. Without this act of generosity from the UK, the region's young livestock would not have survived, he says. His command of detail is impressive. So too is his grasp of the vast problems facing the city's economy. He speaks with fluency of the need to develop a class of small and medium business owners as the backbone of the new market economy. Indeed, he says, the entrepreneurial class should become the basis for the flourishing of our society as a whole. He speaks with precision on the problems of converting the region's vast Soviet-era defence enterprises to civilian production in order to keep them alive. Sprawling plants like the Kirovsky Zavod, a vast artillery and tank producer in the south of the city, had been the region's main employer since Tsarist times. Now they were at a standstill, as the endless orders for military hardware that fueled and eventually bankrupted the Soviet economy had suddenly dried up. We have to bring in Western partners and integrate the plants into the global economy, says the young city official. With sudden intensity, he speaks of the harm communism wrought in artificially cutting off the Soviet Union from the free market relations linking the rest of the developed world. The credos of Marx and Lenin brought colossal losses to our country, he says. There was a period of my life when I studied the theories of Marxism and Leninism, and I found them interesting and, like many of us, logical. But as I grew up, the truth became ever more clear to me. These theories are no more than harmful fairy tales. Indeed, the Bolshevik revolutionaries of 1917 were responsible for the tragedy we are experiencing today, the tragedy of the collapse of our state, he boldly tells the interviewer. They cut the country up into republics that did not exist before, and then destroyed what unites the people of civilized countries. They destroyed market relations. It is just a few months since his appointment as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, but already it is a powerful, carefully crafted performance. He sits casually straddling a chair backwards, but everything else points to precision and preparation. The 50-minute film shows him on the judo mat, flipping opponents over his shoulder, speaking fluent German with a visiting businessman, and taking calls from Sobchak about the latest foreign aid deals. His meticulous preparation extends to the man he specifically requested to conduct the interview and direct the film, a documentary filmmaker known and loved across the Soviet Union for a series he made intimately charting the lives of a group of children, a Soviet version of the popular UK television series 7 Up. Igor Shadkhan is a Jew who recently returned to St. Petersburg from making a series of films on the horrors of the Soviet Gulag in the far north, a man who still flinches at the memory of anti-Semitic slurs from Soviet times, and who, by his own admittance, still ducks his head in fear whenever he passes the former headquarters of the KGB. Yet this is the man Putin chose to help him with a very special revelation. The man who will convey to the world the fact that Putin had served as an officer in the feared and hated KGB. It is still the first wave of the democracy movement, a time when admitting this could compromise his boss Sobchak, a rousing orator who rose to mayor on a tide of condemnation of the secrets of the old regime, of the abuses perpetrated by the KGB. To this day, Shadkhan still questions whether Putin's choice was part of a careful rehabilitation plan. I always ask why he chose me. He understood that I was needed, and he was ready to tell me he was from the KGB. He wanted to show that people of the KGB were also progressive. Putin chose well. A critic once told me that I always humanized my subject matter no matter who they were, Shad Khan recalls. I humanized him. I wanted to know who he was and what did he see. I was a person who would always criticize the Soviet authorities. I endured a lot from them, but I was sympathetic to him. We became friends. He seemed to me one who would drive the country forward, who would really do something. He really recruited me. Throughout the film, Putin artfully takes opportunities to stress the good qualities of the KGB. Where he served, he insists in response to a delicate question on whether he abused his position to take bribes, such actions were considered a betrayal of the motherland and would be punished with the full force of the law. As for being an official, a chinovnik, the word need not have any negative connotation, he claims. He'd served his country as a military chinovnik. Now he was a civilian official serving, as he had before, his country outside the realm of political competition. By the end of the documentary, Shad Khan appears to have fully bought in. The film concludes with a nod and a wink to a glorified KGB past. Putin is shown surveying the icy river Neva, wrapped against the cold in a fur hat, a man of the people behind the wheel of a white Zhiguli, the boxy car ubiquitous in those days. As he watches over the city with a steely and protective gaze, the film closes to the strains of the theme tune from a popular Soviet TV series, 17 Moments of Spring, that made a hero out of an undercover KGB spy who had infiltrated deep into Nazi Germany's ruling regime. It was Shad Khan's choice. He was a person exactly of his profession. I wanted to show how it turned out that he was still in the same profession. Putin, however, had taken care in the interview to give the impression that he'd resigned from the KGB as soon as he'd returned to Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was then called, in February 1990. He told Shad Khan that he'd left for all kinds of reasons, not for political ones, indicating that he'd done so before he started working in May of that year with Sobchak, then a law professor at Leningrad State University, and the fast-rising star of the city's new democratic movement. Putin had returned to the Tsarist-era capital from 5 years of service in Dresden in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, where he'd served as liaison officer between the KGB and the Stasi, the East German secret police. Later, legend had it that he'd confided to a colleague that he feared he might have no better future than working as a taxi driver on his return. Apparently, he was keen to create the impression that he'd cut all ties to his old masters, that Russia's rapidly changing order had cast him adrift. What Putin told Shad Khan was just the start of a string of falsehoods and obfuscation surrounding his KGB career. In the imploding empire that he'd returned to from Dresden, nothing was quite as it seemed. From the KGB villa perched high on the banks of the river Elbe overlooking Dresden's still elegant sprawl, Putin had already witnessed at first hand the end of the Soviet Empire's control of the GDR, the collapse of the so-called socialist dream. The Soviet Union's Warsaw Pact power bloc had shattered around him as its citizens rebelled against the communist leadership. He'd watched, first from afar, as the aftershocks began to reverberate across the Soviet Union, and inspired by the Berlin Wall's collapse, nationalist movements spread ever more rapidly across the country, forcing the communist leader Mikhail Gorbachev into ever more compromise with a new generation of democratic leaders. By the time of Putin's interview with Shad Khan, one of those leaders, Boris Yeltsin, had emerged victorious from an attempted hardline coup in August 1991. The abortive putsch had sought to turn the clock back on political and economic freedoms, but ended in resounding failure. Yeltsin banned the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The old regime suddenly seemed to have been swept away. But what replaced it was only a partial changing of the guard, and what happened to the KGB was a case in point. Yeltsin had decapitated the top echelon of the KGB and then signed a decree breaking it up into 4 different domestic services. But what emerged in its place was a hydra-headed monster in which many officers like Putin retreated to the shadows and continued to serve underground, while the powerful Foreign Intelligence Service remained intact. It was a system where the rules of normal life seemed to have long been suspended. It was a shadowland of half-truths and appearances, while underneath it all, factions of the old elite continued to cling to what remained of the reins. Putin was to give several different versions of the timing and circumstances of his resignation from the KGB. But according to one former senior KGB officer close to him, none of them are true. He would tell interviewers writing his official biography that he resigned a few months after he began working for Sobchak at the university, but his resignation letter had somehow got lost in the post. Instead, he claimed, Sobchak had personally telephoned Vladimir Khrushchev, the then KGB chief, to ensure his resignation at the height of the hardline August 1991 coup. This was the story that became the official version, but it sounds like fiction. The chances of Sobchak reaching Khrushchev in the middle of a coup in order to secure the resignation of one employee seem slim at best. Instead, according to the close Putin ally, Putin continued receiving his paycheck from the security services for at least a year after the August coup attempt. By the time he resigned, his position at the top of Russia's second city's new leadership was secure. He'd penetrated deep into the country's new democratic leadership and was the point man for the administration's ties with law enforcement, including the KGB's successor agency, the Federal Security Service, or FSB. His performance as deputy mayor, as clearly presented in the Shadchan interview, was already slick and self-assured. The story of how and when Putin actually resigned and how he came to work for Sobchak is the story of how a KGB cadre began to morph in the country's democratic transformation and attach themselves to the new leadership. It's the story of how a faction of the KGB, in particular part of its foreign intelligence arm, had long been secretly preparing for change in the tumult of the Soviet Union's perestroika reforms. Putin appears to have been part of this process while he was in Dresden. Later, after Germany reunified, the country's security services suspected he was part of a group working on a special operation, Operation Luch, or Sunbeam, that had been preparing since at least 1988 in case the East German regime collapsed. This operation was to recruit a network of agents that could continue to operate for the Russians long after the fall. Dresden. When Putin arrived in Dresden in 1985, East Germany was already living on borrowed time. On the verge of bankruptcy, the country was surviving with the help of a $1 billion Deutschmark loan from West Germany, while voices of dissent were on the rise. Putin arrived there at the age of 32, apparently fresh from a stint training at the KGB's elite Red Banner Academy for foreign intelligence officers, and began work in an elegant Art Deco villa with a sweeping staircase and a balcony that overlooked a quiet, brightly painted neighborhood street. The villa, surrounded by leafy trees and rows of neat family homes for the Stasi elite, was just around the corner from the grey sprawl of the Stasi headquarters, where dozens of political prisoners were held in tiny windowless cells. Hans Modrow, the local leader of the ruling Communist Party, the SED, was known as a reformer, but he was also heavy-handed in his efforts to clamp down on dissent. All around the Eastern Bloc, the mood of protest was increasing amidst the misery and shortages of the planned economy and the brutality of state law enforcement agencies. Sensing an opportunity, US intelligence agencies, with the help of the Vatican, had quietly started operations to funnel printing and communications equipment and cash to the Solidarność protest movement in Poland, where dissent against the Soviets had always been the strongest. Vladimir Putin had long dreamed of a career in foreign intelligence. During the Second World War, his father had served in the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. He'd operated deep behind enemy lines, trying to sabotage German positions, narrowly escaping being taken prisoner and then suffering near-fatal wounds. After his father's heroics, Putin had been obsessed from an early age with learning German, and in his teenage years he'd been so keen to join the KGB that he called into its local Leningrad office to offer his services even before he'd finished school, only to be told he had to graduate from university or serve in the army first. When, in his early 30s, he finally made it to the elite Red Banner School for Foreign Intelligence Officers, it was an achievement that looked to have secured his escape from the drab struggle of his early life. He'd endured a childhood chasing rats around the stairwell of his communal apartment building and scuffling with the other kids on the street. He'd learned to channel his appetite for street fights into mastering the discipline of judo, the martial art based on the subtle principles of sending opponents off balance by adjusting to their attack. He'd closely followed the local KGB officer's recommendation on what courses he should take to secure recruitment into the security services, and studied at the Leningrad University's law faculty. Then, when he graduated in 1975, he'd worked for a while in the Leningrad KGB's counterintelligence division, at first in an undercover role. But when he finally attained what was officially said to be his first foreign posting, the Dresden station Putin arrived at appeared small and low-key, a far cry from the glamour of the station in East Berlin, where about 1,000 KGB operatives